Well, I guess I'm going to have to project my voice a lot, so hopefully you can hear me. This is the second time filming this video. When I got home, after filming it the first time, I realised that the sound was not working. It sounded like this. So I was like, oh no, okay, I'll go film it again. Probably because it's a really cheap microphone. I've had this a few years now and it's done the job, but I guess I will invest in a new microphone. I'm going to make sure this sounds correct. As you can probably tell, it's not night time, which kind of defeats the object of Fireside stories in a way. Just because to me, at least, in my mind, I kind of picture doing it like in the evening where you're all kind of snuggled up and ready for like a little fireside tale. But because this was the only time I could refilm this video, I'm just doing it in the daytime. So today, I'm going to talk about two previous hitchhiking adventures that I'd had. The one that stands out to me was a lady called June in New Zealand. So the first time I met her, I was hitchhiking to Christchurch. But basically I'd been standing on the edge of the road. It was really hot, middle of summer. You guys been there for about 20 minutes and this lady pulled in and I was like, oh my god, thank you so much for pulling in. And we get talking and then about 30 seconds down the road we see another hitchhiker and she turns to me, do you know her? And I'm like, no. She's like, well, let's pick her up then. So we then pick up another hitchhiker. She's called Julia, she's French, and she was hitchhiking to Christchurch to stay in a hostel. After talking to June for about 10 minutes, she convinces Julia to cancel her hostel and she invites us both to stay at her house. So it turns out that June had been skiving off work that day. She was a school teacher and I think at work she'd had some kind of poor health issues and work had not given her the time off. So she thought for the first time in her life she was going to pull a sickie and she decided to use that sickie to go see Pink Floyd. And that's where she'd been the previous day and she was driving back home. So we drive to Christchurch, look into a lovely house. Turns out that her daughter lives in the garden in a tiny house. Really jealous. And basically she just tells us to relax, treat it like it's our home. She makes us these really great BLT sandwiches for dinner. So me and Juliet go into Pack and Save, which is their equivalent of, I guess, Tesco or Walmart, and we decide to make her a cheesecake. She goes to collect her granddaughter from school and she's really curious about us, and then we end up going to the local zoo and we see like kiwis, we see keas. Keas are like really naughty parrots of New Zealand and they'll like destroy your car and everything. And then we spent the night and the next day we hitchhiked into Christchurch, me and Julia. Had a wander around there, went back, spent another night there. June happened to just be on the internet just having a look what to do in the area and she knew that I was hitchhiking further on and she'd decided, why don't we go to these hot springs? I think they were called Hanmer Hot Springs, and there's also a gas holder on site. So that was really cool to learn about the history of gas holders there, because there were a few gas holders in New Zealand from the late 1800s. I actually went to a gas holder museum in Dunedin, which is really cool. But then also something else June had decided that we were going to do that day was go on a jet boat. And she managed to find these really cheap tickets to go jet boating down this valley, which we did, and I've never done that before and that was amazing. Me off at the next town. We all had like a final meal together and then I pitched my tent on the edge of this beach and I thought that was that, but then a few weeks later I was hitchhiking through Christchurch again and she said come stay with me again. So I spent the night and we actually ended up going to the cinema because it turns out June is a very spontaneous lady, which is, she should always try and be spontaneous in life. And we ended up seeing Three Billboards in Missouri. It's a really great film. I recommend it to anyone debating what to watch. So we watched that, and then we also went out to like a little street market, and we ended up going to a Japanese restaurant, and I got us some okonomiyaki, Japanese style pancakes, which was great. And then we ended up just talking about life, as you do when you get into like hitchhiking travels with people and you interact with people. You end up talking about, I guess, quite deep subjects in a way. She was talking about the advice she had growing up and how she'd given that to her kids, and the one thing I took away from that was the way, if you want to achieve something in life, trying to work backwards from how you're going to achieve it. I think she used her son as an example. Like, he wanted to be the top firefighter in like the New Zealand Fire Brigade, and by this point he had achieved it, but I know back when he was younger, I think he didn't think he was going to achieve that, and she kind of said, well, work backwards, and how are you going to, you know, step by step, then eventually achieve it, and he did. Then I spent the night, she drove me to the outskirts of Christchurch where I could then hitchhike on to the next town. I remember we were in like a queue of traffic and the person in front of us braked really suddenly. I remember she put out her hand to stop me from going into kind of windscreen in front. But no, she's a really lovely person and I will remember her forever. The second hitchhiking adventure which stands out. So I was hitchhiking out of a town towards Takayama in Japan, and I remember walking for about 2 hours to get to the outskirts, walking up this really steep hill, and I saw this lay-by and I kind of peeled off into it, stuck my thumb out for 30 seconds and I got a hitch. That's like my personal best for getting a hitchhike. And a kind of like big fancy saloon car pulled in, and there was a man and woman sitting in front, and they're like, God, could you get in, pretty much. And I got in, and it was quite a fancy car. There was like leather seats, there was like lots of buttons everywhere. I remember there was a suit hanging up and it had little emblems from Tokyo 2020, because they hosted the Olympics. Bear in mind, this was me hitchhiking back in 2017, which seems like a very long time ago now. But basically I get chatting to this couple, and it follows the usual storylines of like what you're doing in Japan, where you're travelling to, and so on. First they asked me, where shall we drop you? And I was like, oh, anywhere in Takayama is fine. Takayama Daijobu. And so they're like, no, seriously, where shall we drop you? And I was like, okay, drop me at the station. And they're like, but where are you staying tonight? Because I guess it was getting late by that point, like late afternoon. And I said, oh, I've got my tent. And they were like, oh, tent, that's so dangerous. And then the guy was like, no. And then they both dissolved into really fast Japanese, so I couldn't keep up. And they were like, hotel. And I'm like, hotel? And they're like, yes, hotel. And I was like, I really hoping that they hadn't like got me a hotel, which would have been slightly awkward. An hour or so later, we arrive in this like massive hotel complex, and we pull up into reception, and the guy keeps beckoning me to follow him. And he walks up to reception, and all of the reception staff bow to him. So it turns out he's the owner of this big hotel complex. And he says something to the receptionist, and she's like, hi. And then he's like, okay, cool. And he's like, enjoy your stay. And I was like, bye, what just happened? And he and the lady left, and the receptionist asked me to follow her. And we go through this series of corridors, and we end up in this kind of like apartment. It was going to be a room, but it turns out it was like an apartment suite. I do have videos of this somewhere, but that man owns the hotel, and I'm guessing that was his personal flat when he comes to stay in the area. They gave me some food tokens, so I got the evening meal for free. I think I got some fried teriyaki, which was lovely, and I also got token for breakfast. But what was really cool was the fact that they had a whole underground onsen, which is like a Japanese spa. So it's obviously segregated, it's split into men and females, and in Japan you obviously strip down to the nude, wash, and then you can enjoy the baths. So I kind of made my way between like the cold plunge pool, the jacuzzi, and they had a whole outdoor section full of like hot bathing areas. and a little place where you could just sit and relax. It was amazing, and I really miss onsens. I wish we had them in this country. And I've mentioned this before, but just the really kind of honest conversations you have with someone when you're kind of sitting there, both quite vulnerable in the nude. Even though you've never met this person, you'll probably never see them again, but you're just sitting there both butt naked, talking about life, or as much as you can with your kind of limited English, limited Japanese, but you make it work. And then they had remember they had a TV on the wall, and they had all these kind of like big reclining chairs. I remember just kind of sitting there in my kind of borrowed dressing gown, kind of thinking, how have I ended up here? Like, what is this madness? I had a lovely night's sleep, checked out, had breakfast, and I also was entitled to a free shuttle bus to drop me in the centre of Takayama, which was like a really old-fashioned Japanese town. So I spent the day wandering around there before continuing on with my journey. Those two are quite, well, very different, but very surreal, and kind of reflects back on the kindness of strangers, which is like what my first video was based on and inspired by. So those are some of my two fondest hitchhiking journeys. I was reading back on my kind of hitchhiking adventures in Japan and New Zealand, and I kept a list in the back of them, and I think in New Zealand I hitchhiked, I think it was like 60 times, which is pretty crazy to think about that. I hope you enjoyed this video, and the next one will probably be wild camping. I hope this was a nice little, I don't know, escapism video to listen to, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.